And welcome back, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. I'm super excited about this podcast recording for a few different reasons, but mainly it's because we're really on high alert with vacationers, Dr. Matt Eby and Joanne Eby, co-authors of the Invisible Threat book. They are in Orlando, in one of the most favorite places on earth. And in pre-show, actually, Dr. Matt, you were sharing with me a little bit that your dad helped to construct Disney World, which, by the way, I never knew about that. So welcome from Orlando, Florida.
Wonderful place for me to be. Disney refers to this as the happiest place on earth. And as far as I'm concerned, that's absolutely true. When we actually got into the parks, when they started reopening the parks, during, when COVID was kind of over, we were in Florida at that time. And when there were no kids around, right? Because they're, parents who they weren't going to bring them here and get kids sick and stuff, of course. But when there were no baby carriages and that kind of, it was the saddest thing ever. Hearing, kids' voices and all that kind of stuff, right? And before that, of course, you'd be complaining that there's big crowds and all that kind of thing. But without kids in Disney, it was just sad. We couldn't wait to see that happening again. And now there are the carriages and the kids' strollers and all that kind of stuff all over again. And it's back to the magic, right? And when kids see the characters around, they really believe that's actually Mickey or Minnie or Donald or Pluto or whoever it is. And we're here with my 3-year-old grandnephew, and he saw Donald Duck yesterday for the first time, and that's his favorite character. And he walked up to Donald and he said, "Donald, I just want to tell you, you are so great." And it was just wonderful. And he's just standing there having a conversation with Donald Duck, and his mom, of course, wants to have a picture, so he wants Kemper to turn around. Kemper didn't want to have anything to do with that. He was standing there having a conversation with Donald, convincing Donald how great he was. It was just terrific. And everybody around is standing there just laughing about the fact that here he is, the 3-year-old, having a conversation with Donald, telling him how great he was. So it's just absolutely magical. So,
And I know for me, when we were here post-pandemic, immediate post-pandemic, and walking through the parks, and part of my mind was like, wow, there's no lineups for the rides. That is great. We can ride over and over and over again. And then after like the fourth or fifth time on, Avatar, it's like there's something missing.
yeah.
And I remember it was some months later, and Matt and I were walking through the Met, and I like, look, strollers.
Yeah.
And that's part of what brings the Disney magic,
Right.
just the kids, but their belief in,
The magic.
the magic
Yeah.
of it. And
Right.
so that has actually reframed my experience here
Yeah.
at Disney and Universal theme parks and everything as well. It's not limited to Disney, but it's just seeing magic through the kids' eyes. And now I just love being even in the theme parks, even if there's a line, it's like, well, that's kind of the point. Like there's
Right.
supposed to be people, there's supposed to be
Yeah.
lines. And so it has really reframed it.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because Christina, born and raised in Southern California, so she grew up at Disneyland. We got married, and that's like her world. I wasn't sure what I was going to feel about it, but it was something really interesting happened. Almost exactly like you, Matt, where there was so much chaos just getting there to the place, to the happiest place on earth. And then I will never forget it. Like it was the very, very first time, especially, and it happens every single time now. All that chaos of just like getting the kids. And, of course, when they're younger, it's even more chaotic. And, whenever we went the very first time, I think they were 5 and 2 or, 6 and 3, something like that. And now they're 22 and 19. Once we got through the gates, everything was gone behind me. It was over. The chaos was over. It was all worth it getting there. And then like just being there, same thing, smile on my face the entire time, just seeing not only my kids, but like all the kids and the energy that kids have and that continuous magic that happens. And for me, because I wasn't there, like my wife growing up, who, she would go, 7 times a year, right? For me, it's just like I'm getting to experience almost for the first time every time with my kids when we would go like on an annual trip. So anyway, I know exactly, what you mean, and I've had the same exact type of an experience, myself with, stuff getting onto the grounds. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, when you were talking about the characters are about 100 years old, the characters are about 100 years old. Obviously, Disneyland started in 1955, but the characters themselves, yeah, they're like 100 years old. It's kind of crazy whenever you start thinking about that, and with relation to like legacy, right? And things that are going to live through, you know, in perpetuity, potentially, way after we're gone. It's gonna be around way after Disney, Walt Disney himself, passed away. His dream still continues to, inspire and encourage, and thankfully we're back to, normalcy there with your experience and seeing all that stuff on the grounds.
I've heard speakers talk about, faith in America, right? And talk about faith in stock markets and those kind of things. And they use Disney as an example. This particular speaker talked about Disney and used it as an example, right? And talking about two investors. And they were saying that, having faith in the stock market, for the long term, and saying that if you believe, talking to the individual, and if you believe that the price of tickets to get into Walt Disney World or Disneyland is going to be more in 5 years than it is today, you can have faith in the stock market. And everybody in the room is going like, oh yeah, the price of tickets to get into Disneyland is going to be more in 5 years than it is today. You can, and everybody's going like, it absolutely is going to be more expensive. And then in the next day in the news, Disney World raised prices to get in there, right? There isn't a grandparent in the world that is not going to take their kid to Disneyland or Disney World somewhere, whether or not that it's Euro Disney or Tokyo Disney or, Disney World, wherever. If they're thinking long-term investment, right, for, stock market investors, they're going to take their grandkid to Disney and they're going to have that experience of time. And that's the whole, that's kind of this mentality of, like you're talking about, legacy planning and estate planning and those kind of things. And this, so we wanted to ask you, you were presenting last week with wealth.com and you were talking about legacy planning. And we wanted to ask you in this particular episode to share that with us about what the topic was, how you got involved with that, and, to talk a little bit more about Epic and Epic services and the mechanics there, and your presentation on the stage last week.
And just before you dive in, Carter, one of the things that resonated with me when you just said legacy and Matt's talking about people going to Disney, but even in the trust administration world, where you see it, where you see that, grandparents in their trusts or in their wills have bequeathed, their, vacation club points or whatever it is they have, or set aside some money. And it's like, this is for, my descendants to be able to enjoy these places. And your company, Carter, is really on the front end of this. Like last week, Carter, you and I talked about the decisions and the different decisions that, you know, institutions make and how like even the regulatory framework can influence those decisions. And we did talk through different decisioning that can be influenced in different ways. None of them right or wrong, just because that's where that fiduciary discretion comes into play. But for your company, you're not focused on that so much, but you're focused on the part where these things are created and established. And your company, like you're at the forefront of helping, clients build those estate plans so that down the road it's going to be like super easy for those, trust companies to make those decisions. So I'm excited to hear about a presentation you made and,
Yeah.
how that ties into the good work that your company does.
Thank you for that, Matt and Joanne. It was a really really awesome experience. I want to give a shout out and a thank to Peak Brokerage and Thurston Capital for inviting us to be panelists on there, and we were panelists on there with Wealth.com, a company that's had Charles Schwab is a big investor in them. I think they to date they've had like over $65 million invested into that company to expand, the operations and the access and the capabilities of leveraging technology. And it was great to be able to be on stage with them on us who are more of a boutique operation. We come at it from obviously a different angle because I come from a different world, as you both know, right? Coming from the more the independent insurance agent world, and how we're utilizing leveraging, if you will, the phrase industry jargon, estate and legacy planning really is what it is. But one of the things that I said on stage was talking about, my backstory and about what was my why. Why did I even start going down this road in the first place? But one thing that I'll say is that what we've really helped to bring access to the mass affluent demographic, that they need, estate and legacy planning also, but we've reframed it and we actually call it family succession planning. The connection there resonates more with that audience, more so than the traditional high net worth, ultra high net worth, right? Where they're just like, oh, it's all about estate planning and my attorney that I have and, whoever's running my family office now, that they get that. But the mass affluent demographic, they've really been underserved, which is why that was my, if you will, my why. So I shared a story on stage, and it kind of ties right back to what we were talking about Disneyland and Disney World. My wife and her family, the very first time, as I was sharing on stage, we went to California to meet what was going to be my in-laws, my father-in-law, now John, and we were there. It's Christmas time. So I mean, I'm a family-oriented guy. I'm really close to my family growing up and everything. Christmas was kind of a really big deal. And we go out there. I meet my wife's, family, my father-in-law, now John, his wife, Elaine, he's remarried now. And I'm getting to know them. I'm like, man, they're really, really cool. So my wife, right? So Christina goes, hey, we're going to go across town to another part of town, and we're going to go see my Uncle Bill and my Aunt Sue. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess cross town. So I guess, we're not all sort of like getting together for whatever reason. We go across town and we go over there, and Uncle Bill, awesome, right? And he is like the obvious brother, right? Like they look so much alike. It was kind of scary, sound alike, the whole thing. And anyway, but while we're there, I just got this sense between meeting with both households that the two of them really didn't connect very often. So as I was sharing on stage, we're driving home. We're coming back on the I-10 after Christmas. And I asked my wife, I said, Christina, I said, what is the deal between your dad and your uncle? Because like I noticed like some friction, almost like some animosity there. And she started sharing with me about how her grandmother Velma, who predeceased her grandfather Samuel, who listeners that have been on here, they've heard me mention Carter Samuel, our son, named after her grandfather, 5th generation. She said, well, when my grandfather Samuel passed away, my dad, right, and my stepmom and my Uncle Bill and Aunt Sue, well, he was the executor. And he was the one that was, my grandfather Samuel had everything all buttoned up. It's in this trust and the whole deal. And that exposure to when you have a individual executor, right? A successor trustee who is going to take the language and they're going to do the administration. And this is, as I was sharing on stage, I'm like, this is way before I'm in the space I'm in now, right? I have no clue, but I got to firsthand experience on what happens to households that they become the trusted, advisor, if you will. They become the estate settlement, individual. They become the ones who have to do all this stuff. And what that really exposed for me, and what it really helped me to highlight and why Epic's platform is so unique in that we took into consideration the things that have happened to me individually. But the reason why, and I said this on stage, my entire question I asked myself when I started going down the path of what Epic Services does is I asked myself one simple question: why do estate plans fail? And failure can mean a few different things, right? But why do estate plans fail? And I wanted to be able to answer that question. Why do estate plans fail? And a lot of it, especially in the mass affluent demographic, right? They might have, $2.1 million that's going to be inherited or divvied up or distributed out, to their posterity. And a lot of it happens because they're under this assumption that, well, I have to have, or I only have the option of having my oldest son or my most successful daughter be the successor trustee. And that's just not so. It's just not. But I can understand that as I went through my own research, as I started going down this path on why that would be assumed by a lot of those households. And whenever I discovered the trust world and the post decease, right? The estate settlement aspect, the dispositive language that needs to be in the documents, the distribution purposes and the grantor's intent, all of those things, right? Culminated with why we do what we do at Epic. And it's not just about a software that we use. That just makes our job easier. It's about the implementation and about the comprehensiveness that we've taken into consideration. And I got to share that on stage, and it was really, really cool being able to be up there and to be able to share in front of this room full of, financial advisors and insurance agents, within the Thurston Capital Peak Brokerage family to talk about, what it is. I started out with, I wanted to be able to figure out a way to help the mass affluent demographic first. Then, of course, eventually, what did we end up doing? We built an entire client acquisition model around solving that problem. But it's really two problems at once that we're solving, right? We're solving, number one, the client acquisition challenge that in a super competitive space that financial advisors find themselves in because they're all competing with one another. And what we know to be called the great wealth transfer, right? Depending on which statistic you look at from Cerulli, it's 84 to 124 trillion dollars over the next 2 decades. That's a lot of money in motion, right? Well, we just built out this entire ecosystem that allows advisors, without having to do a bunch of heavy lifting, to be able to deliver what we call the 3 E's, where they educate, enlighten, and empower a room full of people, typically mass affluent, right? Those that have between 500,000 and 5 million, arguably the most underserved demographic in America today with respect to, again, what we call family succession planning. And being able to share some of those stories about the backstory about this. And here's the one thing that I didn't share whenever I was on stage, and I want to share now. And I'll let you guys, maybe if you have any questions, but the comprehensiveness of what it is that we do was really formed from the understanding and learning about estate settlement and why family fracturing occurs. Most like married couples who are in their 80s, been married for 55 years, right? 3 kids, great family. What they fail to understand, and what we really try to enlighten them on, is the fact that it's not your siblings that are going to be the problem. It's not that your kids, your immediate family, and nothing against those spouses. But here's what I learned whenever my wife was telling me about all this stuff, and I really started, digging a little bit deeper in that actual case study, if you will. It's the spouses of the kids of the family that's when things start getting really dicey, because they want it to be one way, and it wasn't their parents, right? They just know them from whatever. And the old saying of blood is thicker than water, right? It's kind of interesting. So these households, the grantors, right, that are in their 80s, that have this great family environment and these great kids and great grandkids, or the grandkids of the families, and they have these in-laws now, and they love the in-laws. And the in-laws may be phenomenal, but an interesting thing happens when the matriarch and the patriarch pass away. All bets are off. And what I discovered is that a lot of that friction starts happening because of the in-laws that didn't have the same family values, didn't understand, what the worth was, and why the valuables and the values were established within the family dynamics in the first place. So anyway, I wanted to share that today because I didn't share that on stage actually, about how that's what I discovered. It was really the pillow talk that was happening behind the scenes from the spouses of the kids of the grantors.
Was there any thought during this process? And I know that your mechanism is a lot with estate planning and, things that happen after death, right? Posthumous things. Was there any discussion or any thought that was given to inter vivos planning and things that happen before death? Part of what we've been doing, Joanne and I have been doing, and part of the thought process that is going on now in this in our world is how much of this can you do while as the grantor, right? How much of this can you do before you pass in gifting and in things that you can take care of while you're still alive, right? And that you can see the gift, the effect of the gift, the effect of the estate transfer, call it the estate transfer, right? Or you're calling it family succession planning, right? That's the term. And I love the term, by the way. That's a fantastic term. How much of that family succession plan can you execute during your life so that you can see the effect, right? And having whoever your successor is actually step into that role prior to your death so that you don't wait till you pass away and you can move all of this effort up during your lifetime and get significant tax benefit from that gifting, right? The strategy of this, and not wait till there's an estate, that you do this during your life and then guide the beneficiary with your values during your life, and you monitor this during your life. So there's been a real shift in estate planning to have it inter vivos, right? Or during your life. And a lot of that happens so that that you're guiding that person along, right? You kind of step in, it's kind of like Warren Buffett just, kind of did this with his company. And I'm trying to think of the name of the company. Give me the name of Warren Buffett. Berkshire Hathaway, where he now stepped to, I think, CEO or chairman of the board emeritus or something like that. And he's turned over to the company, but he's still kind of monitoring this while he's still alive, right? So he can steer as a steward, he can steer to the ship still. He's 95 years old, but he can steer this, right? So he's done it during his life and stayed on the board, so it's a kind of a really great kind of a plan. And so how much of the discussion or the thought process, or even inside of Epic, right, can you shift a little bit here so that you guide people along, during their life, and have that as kind of the strategy of this, right? And that you're helping clients and don't wait just purely, after death, right? So that's kind of the question.
And a very common model, Carter, is, for the grantors, they'll have a revocable trust. They'll put their assets in it, and then the terms of the trust will determine what happens when they
Yeah.
pass. But the concept, what Matt is saying, simply put, it's like, what about, counseling, the grantors to gift with a warm hand as opposed to a cold hand,
Right.
after they pass.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that grantors get nervous, they're comfortable putting it in a revocable trust. They can control it. They can be trustee during their life. And if they are able to get past that, and it's like, well, why don't we just create the irrevocable subtrust now,
Yeah.
put a trust company in charge of it, and, like we're relinquishing a little bit of control, but we're able to steer the ship, as Matt said,
Mhm.
for what our intent actually is.
Yep.
Obviously, we talked a lot about great wealth transfer while we were there. It is part of the component that we try to help facilitate through some financial planning strategies, right? On being able to have those grantors be able to do some of that gifting now, right? And to be able to set up their posterity and put them under favorable circumstances and to have a successful retirement potentially themselves, right? So that's a beautiful thing. And then also, Matt, I also want to emphasize in their lifetime before they die, but also while of sound mind, because that's the other aspect of, incapacitation has to be taken into consideration also, right? So all of these things tie together. Everything that we're talking about ties together, and we talked about that, and obviously why it's a huge focus. And I'll give a few shout outs to those who are out there as my competitive colleagues, right? We were on stage with wealth.com, but then you have Trust and Will that's coming out. You have Encore State Plans. You have the OG, if you will, LegalZoom, right? You have all these softwares that are out there trying to make it easier, and they're trying to attract advisors to use their system. But I would argue that because of my lived experience, because of the methodology behind, call it the method to the madness, right? This is all about having those discussions for advisors to be under these favorable circumstances to talk about gifting now, to talk about, how we can be able to allow your kids or grandkids, now while you are alive and of sound mind, to see the value that that brings, and, to get these taxable benefits as well. But as you both know on here, there's only one way to truly do that in the most comprehensive way. Some sort of trust company has to play that role, right? So I'm going to turn it back on the two of you and talk about why trust companies themselves, as being held to a higher standard, fiduciarily speaking, and talking about judgment and discretion. Talk a little bit about what you've seen in your experience whenever things like this are established on the front end, so that those, grantors can see the benefit that they can bring to their family now and enjoy that, those taxable benefits for their beneficiaries.
Tying this back into the essence of what our podcast is about, right? The invisible threat. I think that this connects in to discretionary judgment from the onset. And I think that if listeners that are grantors and they're trying to select fiduciaries that are really sound fiduciaries, if they go back and start listening to the earlier episodes and really start to understand how fiduciary judgment forms, they're going to become much more knowledgeable about orientation of a fiduciary and how fiduciary judgment and how fiduciary discretion is actually formed in the mind of a fiduciary. And then when they're interviewing different organizations, trust companies, etc., they're going to be able to ask very intelligent questions. And they can certainly contact either me or you or Joanne to have even deeper questions if they want to ask us specifically to help them identify appropriate fiduciaries and how that their orientation is. And we've demonstrated on our podcast through tools like the fiduciary compass, through the AFIRE design, with the that acronym from anchors and fairness and identity and risk, and how those things orient a fiduciary to make sure that they're making appropriate judgments and that they're not just defaulting to what's the easiest decision to be made underneath ambiguity. And then also the concept of, the theory of fiduciary judgment that I had in my dissertation. So this is relatively recent. My dissertation has only been out for a few months now. So all this is very, very new in the fiduciary space. But we've put this out, on our world, and like you're going to say at the end here, like or subscribe, or make sure that you do your homework, I suppose, and identify how that a trust company does exercise their discretion, and to make sure that that wealthy families, whether or not they're mega wealthy or uber wealthy or ultra wealthy, or that they're just and I don't mean just, but that they have, a few $1,000,000, as you're saying, that they're actually doing their homework to identify an appropriate trustee, and that they, know what the exercise of discretion means, as you're saying, by simply spending a little bit of time watching these podcasts, and then doing doing the due diligence to identify those trust companies.
So Carter, when you asked that question, one of the things that came to my mind, I mean, anybody on the trust administration side of things can give you horror stories, but one of the things that came to my mind was just I thought it was a charming story and just a lovely result. But there was a high school teacher. So talk about mass affluent, no family, no children, high school teacher, had been at the same high school in a small community for just decades. And when he passed, and he had created a trust, like it was a trust under will. And what that trust was to do was every year to hold a concert at the high school he taught at. And he had written some of the music, and so they needed to play some of his music. And then, provided that the trust company could verify that this was done every year, then a certain amount of money would be given to the high school to give to the students, the music students, for a little grant or gift for their college. And so, and I was just doing some work at this, small trust company, and they were telling me this, and I said, "Well, this is charming." I said, and they said, "We've been doing it for 25 years." And they said, and every year we get tickets, and a couple people from the trust company, we have to evidence it, so we go and listen to the concert, and it's charming and delightful. And they had like decades of the tickets to show that they actually went. And this thing, like, it was going to be good for, like, based on the funds, and he didn't leave, like, massive amounts of money, but he left enough to keep this going in the community for 100 years, and it was just, like, those sorts of charming things are what keep me really passionate about this industry.
Yeah.
That's obviously what we cater to, right? We're catering to that mass affluent demographic. And as I, I categorize that again between 500,000 and 5 million. And to be able to create these trust funds, posthumously, right? This is why we do what it is that we do. I actually gave this example. I said my quote on stage, and I talked about how you pass on your valuables, right, is through estate and financial planning, right? But one of the key components that we do, very unique to our platform, and this doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, exist as a comprehensive, solution, what we call the estate plan portfolio. How do you pass on your values? And passing on your values, a lot of times, and arguably, is more important than how you pass on your valuables. And I have this quote that I say all the time, and I shared it with the audience. Wealth, and you said it perfectly, Joanne, right? Wealth can mean many different things, right? This perfect story that you're talking about, a teacher, right? He had wealth. His wealth was what he had to be able to pass on, and he wanted to leave it behind, right? And that was awesome. But wealth, divorced from the wisdom that created it, is all too often wasted by those who inherit it. And our entire makeup and our mechanism that we have is all about how we need to engage with these households, do family succession planning, and to give these households the ability to create those types of stories, right? Because as the saying goes, you can't take it with you, right? So why don't we do it the most optimal way while you're alive, to your point earlier, Dr. Matt, right? And then secondarily, we make sure that we create the language within the trust document that's now irrevocable, that we can have things like that story you just shared, Joanne, for generations. And if you are really, if listeners are listening to this now and you're a potential grantor, this is why we do what we do, right? We want to be able to give you the ability to put something in a concrete, guaranteed way to do it, right? But you have to have all these pieces connected. And this is why we are changing the game in the industry. Do we leverage our software and our technology? Yes, we do. But at the end of the day, you just mentioned it. You were talking about AFIRE. Well, the one last part, it's not AFIRE, right? It's AFIRE for a reason. That emotional aspect of it, that, and these are human beings that we're talking about, that comes into consideration. We're just trying to proactively establish the framework well in advance while you are here, while you are alive, and while you are of sound mind.
Yep.
This is great.
That's what we talked about, on stage. That's what it was all about. And I appreciate you asking, so I can be able to share some of that stuff today, and talk really about what it is that we're, establishing within the advisor network on a national basis, which is also very, unique, and giving the tools and resources that advisors need to help them grow their practice, to also help to retain assets as well. There's specific language as, trust investment advisor language that's in there, and trust protectors, and all those things that come into consideration, that, again, I'll say, as a rule, the traditional insurance agent and financial advisor, they have no idea these things we're talking about, right? You bring that in as a full on, comprehensive idea and plan and structure and ecosystem that we've built, and the infrastructure that we've been building for years, really does make it very efficient for advisors to work with us. And we're getting a lot of traction across the country, and other RIAs and broker dealers are looking at us, because of that very thing. So it's exciting times for Epic Services Company. And I guess, for sake of full disclosure, you were very instrumental in helping us establish that initial foundation and framework. So thank you both for being able to let me sit down across the table from you, share my vision, share the whole idea. And now here we are, 6 years later, talking about how it's all in, actually being implemented on a regular basis.
Well, nobody's worked harder than you, Carter. So we're extremely proud of you, and it's great to be associated with you. And you're just like a dynamo. And yeah, nobody has the energy that Carter Wilcoxson has. I wish I had a tenth of your energy. So it's like, yeah, all that. We're totally proud of you and totally glad to be associated with you, as I said. So keep it going. It's a fantastic, as we said, all the way from the very beginning. It's a fantastic design, a fantastic idea, fantastic business model, and we totally support your progress. And yeah, you and Christina, great people, and we're as I said, couldn't be more proud of you guys. So,
And thanks for sharing your experience from last week. It sounds
Yeah.
like it went great.
Yep.
So thank you.
Hey, listeners, we want to thank you for coming and listening to our podcast once again, the Invisible Threat Podcast, here with my co-hosts, Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby. Very, very excited to be able to continue to share all of these types of things. Today was a little bit different, and hopefully we were able to deliver once again. So until next time, we will see you on the Invisible Threat Podcast. Thank you, everybody.